Europe, in the spring of 1944, is not just an occupied continent. It is a fortress of barbed wire and concrete. From the cold, mist-shrouded fjords of Norway to the sun-scorched peaks of the Pyrenees, the shadow of the Third Reich looms large. For 4 long, agonizing years, hope was reduced to whispers over illegal radio sets. But across the English Channel, in a Britain that had become one massive military camp, the greatest armada in human history was being born. In London, within the underground war rooms of Churchill's cabinet, the air was thick with cigar smoke and the weight of history. General Dwight Eisenhower, a man whose calm exterior masked immense internal pressure, knew he wasn't just leading an army, but a civilization. His task was nearly impossible: to reconcile the egos of powerful generals like Montgomery and Patton while coordinating millions of tons of steel, fuel, and food. Every bolt on every ship, every liter of fuel in every tank, and every life of every young soldier had to be synchronized with the precision of a Swiss watch. Eisenhower knew, if this operation failed, tyranny would rule Europe for decades. This was not just a military operation. It was the industrial, logistical, and moral cry of a free world that refused to fade into oblivion. Before a single soldier stepped into the salt spray of the Channel, a war in the shadows began. A war where the primary weapons were lies and mirrors. Operation Bodyguard was a masterpiece of strategic disinformation, a plan designed to sell Hitler an illusion he was already primed to believe. The Allies knew the enemy expected a blow, so they built him a ghost army. In the fields of southeast England, bases filled with inflatable rubber tanks, wooden aircraft that looked like lethal squadrons to scouts above, and miles of empty tents began to sprout. Fake radio traffic simulated the movement of millions, while double agents fed Berlin information about a grand attack at the Pas-de-Calais. General George Patton, the man the Germans feared more than any other, was intentionally placed in command of this non-existent army to complete the ruse. While German generals, blinded by this deception, held their best panzer divisions in the north, the true fate of the world was quietly boarding ships hundreds of miles away. It was a silent victory for the intelligence officers that bought precious hours for those who would be the first to step onto the sands of Normandy. The night between the 5th and 6th of June was the longest night in modern history. As thousands of paratroopers dropped into the darkness above the marshy fields of France, carrying only scraps of hope and heavy gear, a miracle was occurring at sea. 7,000 ships, from massive battleships to small landing craft, covered the surface of the English Channel so densely it seemed as if one could walk from England to France. When the first rays of dawn lit the coast, German sentries in their concrete bunkers stood paralyzed. The horizon had simply ceased to exist, replaced by an endless forest of steel. 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, soon became slaughterhouses. On Omaha, which history would remember as Bloody Omaha, the sea turned red. Plans shattered under the rain of machine gun fire. Command chains were broken, and tanks sank before they even touched the soil. But in that chaos, where generals were helpless, ordinary soldiers took history into their own hands. Sergeants without orders, soldiers without comrades, crawled through wire and mines, guided only by an instinct for survival and freedom. By the end of the day, the Atlantic Wall had cracked. The price was terrible, but the gates of Fortress Europe had been forced wide open. The delusion that the fall of coastal fortifications would lead to a swift end to the war dissolved in the first kilometers of the Norman interior. The Allies were met by the bocage, an ancient landscape they hadn't foreseen on their maps. These were small fields, enclosed for centuries by thick, impenetrable hedgerows and earthen embankments several meters high. For a modern army, it was a labyrinth from hell. Every hedge hid a German anti-tank gun. Every corner was a sniper's nest. Tanks were blind, and infantry had to gain ground meter by meter, often in hand-to-hand combat. Allied air superiority was useless here, as the enemy blended into the leaves and soil. Constant rain turned the fields into thick mud, and soldier morale began to wither under the relentless pressure of elite SS divisions. Weeks passed, and the front line barely moved. Generals watched the calendar with anxiety. There was a real danger that the invasion would stall in static exhaustion, much like the trenches of the First World War, turning Normandy into a vast, muddy graveyard of Allied dreams. Finally, in late July, General Omar Bradley decided it was time to end the agony of the Hedgerows. He devised Operation Cobra, a strike that was not surgical but apocalyptic. The plan was to concentrate the entire power of the strategic air forces on just a few kilometers of the front near the town of St. Lo. Thousands of heavy bombers covered the sky, and the earth shook under a carpet of bombs that literally erased German defensive lines from the face of the earth. In that moment, while the dust still covered the ruins, Eisenhower unleashed George Patton. His Third Army poured through the resulting gap like a torrent breaking a dam. Patton didn't care for flanks or caution. He smelled blood, and he wanted speed. His tanks shifted from a crawling pace to a gallop, racing through Brittany and toward the heart of France. The German command system began to collapse under this incredible velocity. It was the moment when the war shifted from a bloody struggle for every hedgerow into a dynamic race across the plains, a race the Germans could no longer win. The race forward had its dark side, a hunger for resources. The faster Patton's tanks went, the further they were from the ports that fed them. At one point, the front was moving so fast that maps became obsolete within hours. Fuel became more valuable than gold. For the army to continue its march, the Red Ball Express was created, a logistical feat without which the entire invasion would have stalled. Over 6,000 trucks created a continuous chain connecting the beaches of Normandy to the front lines. Roads were reserved exclusively for them. Trucks raced day and night. Drivers slept at the wheel, and engines weren't turned off for weeks. Most of these heroes were African Americans who, under conditions of segregation and constant danger from air attacks, hauled millions of tons of cargo. Without their sweat, without every canister of fuel they delivered under the cover of darkness, the Allied machine would have simply shut down in the middle of France, leaving the infantry without protection or ammunition. The Red Ball Express was the heart that pumped blood into the muscles of the liberating army. While northern France burned in the flames of the breakout, on August 15, 1944, a second chapter of liberation opened, Operation Dragoon. Allied forces, composed of Americans and veteran French colonial troops, landed on the Azure coast. Although this landing is discussed less frequently than Normandy, its strategic importance was immense. The Germans, already shaken by defeats in the north, found themselves in an untenable position. The primary goals were the major ports of Marseille and Toulon, vital deep-water terminals that could receive ships with heavy equipment directly from America. While tourist resorts turned into battlefields, German Army Group G began a desperate retreat north along the Rhone River Valley, trying to avoid total encirclement. France was now being strangled in a pincer that tightened from two sides. This blow from the south stripped the Germans of any hope that they could hold France as a bulwark. The walls of their fortress were crumbling faster than they could patch them. In mid-August, the fate of German forces in France reached its bloody culmination near the town of Falaise. The strategic pincers finally closed. From the north, British, Canadian, and Polish divisions pressed down, while from the south, the Americans surged upward. In a narrow gap, which became known as the Mouth of Hell, over 50,000 German soldiers and thousands of pieces of heavy equipment remained trapped. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Allied aviation destroyed convoys in low-level flights as they tried to escape through the only remaining corridor. The roads became impassable with wrecked tanks, burnt trucks, and thousands of carcasses of horses and men. The smell of death over Falaise was so intense that pilots claimed they could smell it in their cockpits. Although some German troops managed to escape, they left behind all their equipment and all their hope. German military power in France ceased to exist as an organized resistance. The road to Paris was now wide open. Paris was always more than a city. It was the spirit of a free Europe. Eisenhower initially planned to bypass the city to avoid street fighting and the massive logistical burden of feeding millions of civilians. But history does not wait for the permission of generals. When the Parisian resistance rose in revolt, the fate of the city hung by a thread. General Charles de Gaulle knew, if the French did not enter Paris themselves, the legitimacy of the new state would be in question. Under immense pressure, Eisenhower relented and gave the order to General Leclerc and his 2nd Armored Division to move forward. On August 25, 1944, after 1,500 days of Nazi tyranny, the first French tanks rolled across the bridges of the Seine. The scenes that followed were surreal, a mixture of unspeakable joy, tears, and vengeance. The Champs-Élysées were flooded with people hugging their liberators under the shadow of the Arc de Triomphe. Paris was its own again, and the sound of church bells echoing throughout the city announced to the world that the end of the darkness was near, even though the bloody sun of war still stood high in the east. After the fall of Paris, a euphoria bordering on recklessness took hold. In Allied headquarters, it was believed the German army was in total disarray and the war would be over by Christmas. Tanks raced through Belgium and eastern France at 50 kilometers a day. But this unprecedented momentum collided with an invisible yet unbreakable enemy: empty fuel tanks. Supply lines had stretched to over 500 kilometers from the Normandy beaches. Every kilometer of progress meant the Red Ball Express trucks had to consume more fuel just to deliver fuel. Here begins a great drama between commanders. Montgomery demanded all resources be given to him for one grand leap over the Rhine, while Patton fumed, claiming he could enter the heart of Germany if they gave him just a few thousand liters of gasoline. Eisenhower had to make an impossible decision: whom to favor at a time when everyone was exhausted. This lull at the German border gave the enemy exactly what they needed most: time to breathe and prepare for a final defense. As the Allies finally approached the border of the Reich itself, the euphoria vanished. Before them stood the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, thousands of concrete bunkers dug into hills, protected by kilometers of dragon's teeth, anti-tank obstacles that looked like the teeth of some stone monster. The Germans, now fighting for their own homes and under the threat of execution for desertion, provided a fanatical resistance not seen in France. The battles in the Hürtgen forest and around the city of Aachen became the bloodiest encounters the Americans had ever experienced. Every village was a fortress, every forest a trap. The maneuvering war that liberated France died here, replaced by brutal attrition. The winter of 1944 arrived early and was merciless. The Allies learned a bitter lesson. The liberation of France was a triumph of logistics and speed, but the breakthrough into Germany would require raw, blunt force and sacrifices that would overshadow everything that happened on the beaches of Normandy. As the camera slowly pans over the map of liberated Europe, numbers become faces and arrows become graves. In less than 100 days, the Allies achieved the impossible. They destroyed 2 German armies, captured over 500,000 enemy soldiers, and returned freedom to a people who had forgotten what it looked like. But that freedom had its price, written on thousands of small metal tags around the necks of young men who would never return to Ohio, London, or Toronto. Normandy is quiet today, its fields are green, but beneath that soil rests a generation that gave their youth so we could have our old age. Cemeteries like the one at Colleville-sur-Mer, with endless rows of white crosses and stars of David facing west, are a permanent reminder of the fragility of peace. France was free, its cities breathed again, but the silence of those cemeteries echoed louder than all the victory parades. Every inch of land was paid for with someone's dream, someone's future cut short on the dusty roads of Normandy and Brittany. The film about the liberation of France ends here, on the doorstep of Germany, but its message echoes through the decades. We see the final image, a map slowly turning from war colors into the peaceful tones of modern Europe. Generals Eisenhower, Montgomery, and de Gaulle fade into history, leaving behind a world they changed fundamentally. France was no longer a battlefield, but a symbol of renewal. As the camera follows the last train leaving Paris toward the east under the setting sun, we realize this was not just a story of military victory. It was a story of the victory of logistics over chaos, cooperation over ego, and above all, the will of the common man over tyranny. The beaches of Normandy are now places where children play, but the spirit of those who jumped into the unknown there in 1944 remains eternally present in every breath of freedom Europe takes today. As the screen slowly fades to black, only the words that guided these men through the darkest hours remain. In victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill. This was the legacy of the summer when the world refused to give up.